Thank you, everybody, and welcome to this evening's author talk in conversation with Jane Gilmore and Claire Halliday. Before we start, just some housekeeping. If you can keep your microphones on mute, there is a mic symbol on the bottom of your screen, so if you can just click that to turn it off. And our preference is also just to turn off your videos as well, just because it can be a little bit distracting when there are so many people here. There is a chat function, which is the speech bubble icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will be asking questions at the end of the session. So if you do have a burning question, you don't think you're going to be able to remember it, please type it into the chat thread and we will scroll back through and ask as many questions as we possibly can. We are recording this session and you will receive a link to the video after today. And I'd just like to acknowledge that we're bringing this event to you through a partnership with Latrobe City Libraries, East Gippsland Libraries and Miley Library Services. If you're not a member of your local library, please sign up because your support helps us to deliver more events like this. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today we're welcoming Jane Gilmore, a consent educator who launched the Fix It campaign in 2014 as a response to the way the media reports on men's violence against women. Her debut book, Fixed It, was published in 2019. Teaching Consent is her second non-fiction book and is published by Body Safety Australia. We're also welcoming Claire Halliday, who started her professional writing career as a regular freelancer to the Sunday Age and a diverse range of other women's and men's lifestyle magazines more than 25 years ago. Since then, she's written 5 adult non-fiction titles of her own and dozens of fiction and non-fiction titles for a children's educational publisher, as well as ghostwriting for others. She's also a copywriter, creating content for leading brands and businesses. So I'm going to hand over to Claire and Jane now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jane, you can start this off.
Okay, I just want to add to the wonderful welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, just by saying that, and I say this every time I hear it, this is not specific to this event or to libraries or anything like that, but as we'll talk about during the next hour or so, one of the things, the concepts that's really key in consent is making sure that your actions match your words. So I have on my phone, on the phone browser, a tab open for the Aboriginal Legal Service. And every time I hear an acknowledgement or a welcome to country, I try and donate to the Aboriginal Legal Service, or if I don't have the money, which sometimes happens, I will try and find somebody on social media, a First Nations person on social media that I haven't followed before, and follow them, or read articles or watch TV shows, or even read a poem, just see some art, just something where I'm trying to match actions to words so that my understanding improves. And every time I get the opportunity to say something like this after hearing an acknowledgement or a welcome to country, to say that and encourage people as much as they can to do the same and to share it on.
Thank you for that, Jane. I think that's important and absolutely ties in with everything that we're about to talk about tonight. And hopefully at the end of this talk, people may feel that they have an understanding of issues more. Perhaps they might feel more confident to take actions, however large or small, in their own lives, hopefully to make a positive change around this issue. So we are talking to Jane Gilmore tonight. Thank you. The book Teaching Consent. Now, as Vicky Dado said before at the start, this is a true collaboration of 3 regional libraries. So we're really grateful to East Gippsland and Latrobe and Miley Libraries for making this event possible. We'll be doing questions at the end, as was said. So please type them in any time during the talk, and we'll come to them at the end because we want to make sure we've got lots of time to answer questions. But Jane, for now, I just want to sort of jump straight in. And I thought a good question to start with might be sort of twofold. First of all, really what compelled you to write this book now? And also tell us about Body Safe Australia and how that fits in with the book.
Well, those questions are kind of linked. Body Safety Australia is a not-for-profit organisation started by Deanne Carson, who I've known for many years. She's a consent educator. She started working in the field doing education for small children to help them protect themselves or report child sexual abuse. And we've often talked over the years about various work-related things, and I was starting to get a bit burnt out by journalism and writing about the effects of violence. And Dion said to me one day, well, why don't you hop over the fence and join us in prevention and start working to try and stop it before it happens? So I did. So she took me on board and we did a lot of training. And then I started going into classrooms teaching. I was more at the older end, teaching secondary school kids of all ages and genders from year 7 through to year 12 about consent and respectful relationships. And it is the curse of the writer that once you have an experience that really profoundly impacts you, you can't not write about it. So I started just writing down stories as they happened, trying to work out what I was going to do with them. And it started, the idea was going to be a leaflet to explain to parents what was happening in the consent classes, because they can often find it quite frightening and worrying that a stranger is talking to the children about sex. So that was how it started, and it just sort of grew and grew and eventually became the book. And so we decided to publish it that way.
Because the book is made up of truly voices from the consent classroom. And you're mentioning now that, you know, you've been jotting them down while you're listening to them, and I guess feeling confident that you had enough stories to put together in the book, and it would sort of tell the story that you needed it to tell. I imagine you might have ended up with too many stories, so which is kind of a sad thing. But yeah. How did you choose the stories that did make it in?
Look, it was difficult because it's quite a small book. Because BSA were publishing it themselves, we didn't have the resources to publish a full book size, which I could have done very easily and still would like to one day, because there was a lot more that didn't make it into the book than what did make it in. We kept it very narrowly focused on consent, things like respectful relationships, and as I said, the child abuse prevention education, some of the sex education, and a few other related stuff that we do. We kept trying to sort of tease that out, although they're so closely interlinked that it wasn't always easy. But I just kept trying to answer the question of why do we teach consent? What are the reasons that we need to teach consent? How do we teach it? And what are the reactions from the kids when we teach it? And just trying to answer those 3 questions and keep that really, really narrow focus. But keeping a narrow focus is not one of my strong suits. So it was an arduous process, lots of editing.
You've described the word consent, the concept of consent, as something that is all at once, both very simple and very complex. Can you just expand on what you mean by that?
Yes, I think it's simple because you can define it in, I think it's 6 words. It's complex because people often don't understand it. So the way we define consent when we're teaching it or when I'm talking about it is that it's both people actively want to share touch. Very simple sentence. It's complex because particularly in well, I was going to say particularly in classrooms, but actually, no, I don't think that's true. A lot of people think about consent in terms of yes or no. You have to get a yes and you have to stop if you get a no. And often what we hear, particularly from young people, but again from older people as well, is that while there may have been a technical yes, it wasn't consensual. It wasn't 2 people actively wanting to share touch. And teasing those differences out is part of consent education, because it's understanding that just getting somebody to say yes does not mean that what happens after that is consensual. That it's about understanding how you feel, how they feel, how that can change from moment to moment, from act to act, and that's perfectly okay, because what you're looking for the whole way through, whether it's somebody you've known for 10 minutes or 20 years, what you want the whole way through for a fully consensual act is that both people actively want it the whole way through.
And the impact of misunderstanding those nuances are told in a very heartbreaking way in the opening story of your book, which I know is a difficult story for you to tell, but could you just give us a little snapshot of it so people get a good understanding of the complexities?
It was the moment when I realized that I had to write this down properly, not just the little scraps of notes that I'd taken and publish it, because it was a year 10 group that we'd gone in to do quite a long discussion about sex ed and consent. And often when you're doing those big groups, because you don't have a chance to talk to kids individually in the classroom, somebody who's got something that they need to talk about will come up afterwards. So where I have the opportunity, often I'll sort of take a bit of time to pack up my notes and computer and everything at the end so that people can come up and ask questions if they want to. And a girl came up to ask a question. She was, I think, 14 or 15. She was still gangly and awkward the way kids that age often are. And she was so young and so fragile. And she came up and said to me in this whispered little voice, if something happened and I was too scared to say no, does that mean it's still my fault? And it just broke my heart, because I could see in her face when I was telling her that of course it wasn't her fault, and that it's perfectly understandable, that it's a common response to freeze. And I went over all those things and I was watching her and I could see she didn't believe me. And I talked to the teacher and the school counselor and a whole lot of people at the school about it afterwards, because obviously, you know, you don't just walk away from something like that. You've got to go and make sure she's okay. And they all knew about it. The boy is also in her class. They were friends. He'd been approached about it. He insisted it was consensual. She didn't say no. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Why are you asking me about my sex life, as he called it? The teacher was beside herself. His parents were threatening to sue. All the other kids knew about it. She was being bullied. The teacher was worried whether she was even going to finish year 10. It was just this horrible, horrible situation for everybody involved. And, you know, I'm getting into a different part of consent discussion, but their only options was to go to the police or do nothing, because that's all the legal system allowed. And because his parents were threatening to sue, they just said, well, there's nothing we can do. And so the school was horrified. It was partly why they got us in. The teacher she was in tears when she was talking to me. She was beside herself, because she felt, as most teachers do, a deep sense of responsibility to both kids, because they're both her students. And she was saying, this boy, something's so wrong that he didn't understand that what happened was not consensual. How could he not have known? And he was saying to her, but how could I have known? And to me, this whole story just summed up so exactly what happens when people don't understand consent, when they're not taught to think about it well before they start having sex. And it's still the story. It still haunts me. I still think about all the people involved in that. And it's still part of the reason that I think this book is so important, and why I'm still so willing to talk about it to anybody who will stand still long enough and let me.
And I guess in the past, and probably, you know, still now in some schools, especially perhaps religious schools or you know, families that have very strict sort of conservative values, stretching your mind beyond just saying no as the appropriate sex education for your kids is a big leap. And, you know, you're talking about teaching consent and you know, saying yes and saying no, but for parents to even understand that their child might have that moment where they want physical touch and they want a certain amount of physical touch, they don't necessarily want the full gamut of physical touch, is a lot for some parents to take on. So those conversations, I imagine, would be really complex as well with that in mind.
It is. And I really understand that. It is awkward talking to your teenagers about sex. It's awkward talking to your children about sex. And it's one of the things that I wrote about in the book. At almost any age, you talk to the kids and then you talk to the parents, and you get exactly the same reaction when they have to even contemplate thinking about sex. The kids will go, ooh, yuck, parents don't have sex, ooh. And the parents will go, oh God, no, I don't want to think about my kids having sex. It's just this knee-jerk reaction of, I don't want to think about it. And so asking them to talk to each other about it can be really difficult and confronting. And I understand that. And that's partly why I think it's so important that we talk about it at schools. And for the kids that are really self-conscious about it, it actually helps to have somebody like me come in, because they don't know me at all. They don't read the sort of work that I do, but to have someone they don't know come in, because also I'm going to get up and leave when it's all over. So they can ask me questions about things that they've seen in porn or that they've heard about doing, or that they don't even, ask me definitions of things. And because I'm now just almost incapable of being embarrassed by any of those things, and so I don't get embarrassed or uncomfortable, and I can answer their questions really calmly and easily. So that encourages more questions. And of course they've got questions. Everybody's got questions about sex. That's not like that suddenly stops when you're an adult. There's plenty of adults I know that have questions as well. But what most of us will do if I don't know, if a 9-year-old hears the term blowjob in the schoolyard and wants to know what it is and doesn't have any adults around that they can ask, what's the obvious thing they're going to do? They're going to go and Google it. And they're not necessarily going to get the sort of information you would want them to have in response to that question. So while it's difficult for parents to have those conversations, knowing that somebody who's well-informed and kind and empathetic and non-judgmental is going to start that conversation and is going to hopefully, if the school's doing it right, engage with the parents as well. So I would not want to go into a school and run a consent class or run a sex ed class and not have done a parent workshop beforehand where we say, this is what we're going to talk about. This is what we're going to tell your kids. These are the questions that they will likely have, although you can always guarantee that something will come out way out of left field that you can't anticipate. But this is the approach that we take. And so when your child comes home, having heard all of that, you can ask them about it. Here's some questions you can ask about how they're feeling about it. Here's some points that you could discuss. Here's some ways that you can discuss it so that they're more comfortable with what's happening and some of that pressure is taken off parents. I see the consent classes and school sex ed classes as an assist to parents, not taking over from them or doing their job for them. It's helping them start those conversations.
And I guess a lot of schools would appreciate you coming in as well, because in a way, a lot of parents have kind of handballed that, and we've kind of thrown teachers under the bus out of their depth, that they have to kind of have these conversations with their students, which can be as uncomfortable for them as imagine, and, you know, maybe isn't getting the best out of getting the best result, like you said, because the students who have to see that teacher again the next day aren't necessarily going to reveal anything particularly, you know, enlightening or controversial that they might think is embarrassing.
I mean,
so
sorry, go on.
Yeah. I was just going to say, how does that relationship between you and the school happen? Does the school invite you? Do parents sort of petition the school and say, hey, we want this person to come?
It happens a bit both ways. So sometimes the schools will come to us directly. Sometimes it'll be because a parent said, we'd like more of this kind of education, have a look at this organisation, and we'll send them a specific link. Sometimes it will be because something's happened at the school where they've suddenly realised the extent of things that are going on between the teens at school. Certainly after lockdown, when image abuse was absolutely rife, it was more common than COVID in those pandemic months, whenever we sent all the teenagers home and gave them a laptop and 2 years of nothing else to do. So it was absolutely endemic when we got back, and there was some really, really awful things going on. So we were incredibly busy in those first few months coming out of lockdown, helping schools to respond to that. I certainly don't think it's gone away. And we still get regularly called in to respond to something awful's happened. Even sometimes teachers always know when something bad is going on with a couple of the kids, but when all the kids know about it, even if they don't know the details, teachers always know more than the kids think they do. And because, as I said, the options for teachers in those situations where there's been some kind of assault or sexual assault in the schoolyard, their options are call the police or do nothing, neither of which are really great outcomes for teenagers, for children. We can sometimes provide a third option of education and discussion and help in hoping that we can change, or at least help kids better understand the attitudes that they have and the things that can lead to.
And so you think that positive change is still possible even in those sort of upper secondary years? Because you've said that you're talking about teaching consent to teenagers is kind of a question that is too late in many ways, because if they don't understand it, something bad may have already happened or is about to. Yeah,
look, it's, as I said, it is common that we get called in after something has happened. I would certainly prefer to be there beforehand, but that requires, well, what is starting to happen now, which is a whole of school, whole of community, whole of life approach to consent, where we start in kindergarten. I think the curriculum's starting at prep, where you start talking about consent, well, you're obviously not talking to 3 to 6 year olds about sex, but you're talking about consent in that same framework of, do both people want this, actively want this? So you're talking about it in terms of, do you want to share your lunch? Can I hug your teddy bear? Can I give you a hug? Do you want to hold hands when we walk out of the classroom? That consent is something that you need to start thinking about then. So for those kids, if they're taught that, and if they're taught how to think about it in those empathetic, respectful terms, and in those everyday interactions where they can really see how that works. It's not a intellectual exercise. It's I want to give my friend a hug and he doesn't want me to hug him, kind of working through those things. By the time they get to 16 and you're talking to them about consent and sex, it's a very easy discussion. If they've never had those lessons before and they've never had to think about consent as an empathetic, respectful reaction, if they've not thought about girls and women or sexual partners as people. So often what we'll get in some small groups, usually boys, but not always, but some small groups of kids in single sex schools, is they become very, very isolated and, oh my God, girls, they're just this other, they're not people like us. And so when it comes to sexual encounters, they don't always understand that this is just another person like me, who has feelings and thoughts and needs and desires and confusion, as I do. And with those kids, again, it's just a matter of reinforcing that. And I did find a lot of hope in those classrooms, because coming from journalism, where you're sort of always reporting after the worst has happened, and a lot of the work that I was doing, which was crisis response far more than prevention, I was seeing too much of the worst that can happen. And in classrooms, usually what you see is not that. That when awful things do happen, most of the time it's sad because it was so preventable, because it's not deliberately, maliciously violent and aggressive, although that can happen, but it's much rarer than the just failure to understand and to think. And it's sad because it's preventable, but most of the kids are just awkwardly trying to work things out. And most of them want to still have that hope for being a great person. They have aspirations to being somebody that other people look up to. And that's very, very present in children and young people. And it gives me a lot of hope when I go into those classrooms, because that's much easier to respond to and to teach to than when you're talking to adults, where a lot of those attitudes are hardened in and they can be a lot more defensive and aggressive when you start talking about this stuff. Sometimes you'll see it in classrooms with boys who are, there's one group of 14-year-old boys who were talking to me about, oh, women are just gold diggers. And I went, yeah, sure. Are you talking about your mum? Is that what happened when she married your dad? And they were all horrified. No, not my mum. Your sister? No, not my sister. Your friends? No, not them. Well, who? Who do you know who's actually like that? And they couldn't name anyone. And most of them had never been on a date. So it was very easy to see that this gold digger myth didn't come from anything they'd ever actually seen. It came from stuff they'd seen online. And once we got that out and started to work through it and started to say, well, think about the women you know. That's who he's talking about. It was Andrew Tate, of course. That's who he's talking about. Are the women that you know like that? Have you ever seen any evidence in your life of the things that you see every single day when you're interacting with real people? Have you ever seen that happening? And they go, oh, no, I haven't. So why do you believe this one man on the internet? What's his aim? What's he getting from this? And, most of the time it's about asking questions and they answer it themselves. It's not me going in there and saying it's because of this and he does this and because that just doesn't get anywhere. It's asking questions and getting them to think about it. And when they come to those conclusions themselves and go, oh yeah, actually you're right. Yeah, okay. And then they just kind of move on as if it's, okay, I've got that idea clear now. Okay, what's next? And again, there's those moments of hope in that, because undoing those ideas and showing them how they just don't fit with what they actually know, it's almost like this, you can see a bit of a weight lift off them, because I think there's that, what we call cognitive dissonance, where they're carrying this idea because they've heard it, but it actually doesn't fit with what they know and what they see. So there would be some kind of confusion there, and having that relieved of, oh yes, okay, the reason that the idea and my experience don't actually match is because the idea is wrong, not because my experience is wrong. And I think that's sometimes a bit reassuring.
And you mentioned, one man on the internet, Andrew Tate, he seems to have gone through, that 14 to 15-year-old boy like a disease at the moment, especially. I mean, this is a gendered issue. We're talking on the day after International Women's Day. But I suppose boys have their own issues too about consent. So tell us about that. And is it more difficult for them because of all those other things that swirl around boys and what it is to be a boy and what it is to be a man when they have something going on too?
Yeah. It became so clear to me in this work. So many times I felt so sad for boys. I remember Diane telling me about, I didn't do kindergarten work, as I said, but Diane telling me about going into a kindergarten and a little 4-year-old boy upset by something, but trying not to cry because boys don't cry, and pushing away, no, don't hug me, I don't need comforting, I'm fine. He was 4 and he was sad and he was crying. And of course he needs a hug and some comfort. And this idea that, no, I shouldn't, it's weak, it makes me weak to accept comfort. He absorbed that at 4. And it breaks your heart, because these boys are loving and affectionate and kind, and you can see that in the way they are with each other, but you can also see them sort of trying to cover it up and trying not to show it, and then you start talking to them about it, and the words are so gendered. Go into boys' schools and they'll talk about, oh no, that's just being a girl, or that's just being weak, or that's being pick. What a phrase I hadn't heard before was pick me, which is just asking for attention. And we'd been talking about bullying, I think, and oh no, we wouldn't go talking about it because that's so pick me. And I'm like, but if you've been bullied and you're sad or you're scared or you're feeling lonely, you should be given attention. It's right that somebody pays attention to how you're feeling and notices and talks to you about it and offers some comfort and some help. Oh no, it's pick me, girls do that. And I was listening to this thinking, how can we tell boys of this age that the result of this is these men that I've met so many of them, often sadly in perpetrator situations, but these men who have had so many pieces of themselves carved away, where they think the only emotions that make them a man is rage and lust, and anything else is shame. And they're the men that we know become perpetrators. And I certainly don't think it's too late for those boys, because they will talk about it and they will acknowledge that, yes, this is what we're told to be because we're boys, but it's not who we really are. And I did one exercise once with a group of 15-year-old boys, where I got them to call out words that I wrote on the board of, when you're an adult, what words would you like other people to use when they describe you? And first they started talking about successful and good looking and good at sport, that stuff. And I said, no, what you do, not what you do, but who you are. And they started talking about kind and thoughtful and a good father and a good man and funny and a good friend, all the sorts of things that this was what they knew to aspire to when they grow up to be a man. And those moments, again, is where I go, okay, there is good reason to hope, not just reason to hope, but really strong, good reason to hope. But we need to reinforce that with boys, because it's still precarious. And, Andrew Tate was a symptom, not a cause. And as he disappears, another one will float up to take his place. But those people are successful because they tap into that fear that is not born into boys, that is taught to boys, that they are under threat, that they can't show weakness, that they have to carve off all those soft bits of themselves or they will be less of a man. And that hurts. It hurts them. And I think that's what the Andrew Tates of the world tap into, is that hurt. And it's the pain, it's that hurt that makes Andrew Tate powerful and dangerous, and the next Andrew Tate and the one after him and the one after him. So if we can find a way to ease that pain, to stop them feeling that they have to shrink themselves smaller and smaller, but they can be all the things, then I think we take the power away from the people that weaponize that pain and make it really dangerous.
I think that's a good time to probably talk about support and support networks and help that is out there, because have you seen that changing in any way in the time since you've been covering these stories? Because if people can't feel like they can access the appropriate resources, if they don't feel it's easy to find somebody to talk to or who they think will listen to them, then the problem stays.
I think we all know that almost all support services of any kind are stretched to breaking point at the moment. There's staff shortages, there's burnout particularly in Victoria, after 2 years of lockdown. So the official support services, they're there, and they take a bit longer to answer the phone, but they do answer the phone eventually. And we always make sure that we tell kids that, because realistic expectations, if you call them or if you try and web chat them, you might be waiting a while, but hang in there because somebody will get to you. But I think the other thing we really need to do is give communities confidence and knowledge and strength so that they can reach out to their own network, because it's one of the exercises we do from the tiny little kinder kids right through to year 12 at the end of the program, is get them to write down 5 adults that they can go to if they're in any kind of trouble, the names of 5 adults that they can go to ask for advice or comfort. And with the little kids, they make little felt finger puppets, and they draw the faces and write the names on them, and the kids take their little finger puppets home. And the older kids we give metal key tags to so that they can hold on to it. And it can be really heartbreaking. I was out at a regional school, very, very small school. There was about 50 kids from prep to year 12. The whole school was about 50 kids, and they had shovels outside to manage the snakes, which, you know, I live in St Kilda. This was horrifying, but there was a boy there who was in that shadowland between being both victim and perpetrator, because he was both at home and with his mates, and he was also heartbreaking. When we were doing this exercise of 5 adults you can go to, I went up to him to help him with it, and he was just sitting there just staring at the pen trying to break it, because he said he didn't have anyone. And I worked with him for a while, and eventually I had to go and get another key tag for him because he filled all 5. Because then he was thinking in terms of immediate family. You know, there's only had one parent, the other parent was not available, no other family around. But then we started talking about people in his community, parents of his friends that he'd got to know, an adult that he knew at a job that he had, one of the neighbours that he spent quite a bit of time with, it was a working farm, helping him on the farm, that he really trusted. So we went through this whole list of people. And often you find when you talk to teenagers that they know their parents are there. And if they've got a reasonable relationship with their parents, they'll say, well, you know, if I get arrested or something, well, yes, I'd call mum and dad. But some of the stuff, it's part of the breaking away from the parental bond, is some things you don't want to talk to your parents about. And that can be hard as a parent, and I know because I've done it, but also you want to know that if they're not, the way I had it with my kids, if you're not going to come to me, I want to know you've got somebody that I trust to go to. So I've talked to a few of my friends and a few members of the family and sort of worded them up and said, look, I've told them if they have a problem, come to you, and you can keep that secret as long as their lives are not in danger, if that's what they need, because they need to be able to come to someone. And it's not just about saying, oh, go to Uncle Bob and leave it to Uncle Bob to sort it out. You need to go and sit down with Uncle Bob and say, look, these are the things that I want them to know. This is what I want them to know about porn. This is what I want them to know about consent. This is what I want them to know about sex. This is what I want them to know about relationships. If you don't feel that you can have that conversation with them, let me know. And empowering people in your, you know, it takes the village, getting your village ready to help you raise that child is one of the most powerful things we can do. This is what I want you to do if my child comes to you and says that somebody's hurt them. This is what I want you to do if my child comes to you and says they're pregnant. This is what I want you to do if my child comes to you and says they're afraid of somebody. And having those things there so that the village is prepared can be so powerful in ways that you really don't recognize until you start educating that community. And that's also a lot of what we do. Like I said, it's not just about going into schools and talking to kids. It's also about professional development for teachers so that they know how to answer a lot of those questions. Education for parents, for community leaders, for church leaders, if it's a faith-based community, for sports leaders, for the local book group, if that's what your kids are into, the local drama group, like wherever your kids are going, where they're meeting adults that you want to be part of their village, those adults need to have the tools to actually do that really well. And that's what we mean by whole of community engagement.
Yeah. Let's talk more about that village and that community. And I guess I'm curious because we are speaking through a network of regional libraries. You've mentioned the obvious difference about going to a regional school and it was so small. But I mean, culturally, there's differences too. How is teaching consent different to regional, more isolated kids, less streetwise city kids? Then, is that just a cliche and not right?
No, I think there are differences. There's subtle differences. So the things that I noticed in the regional schools is the country kids tend to be less dependent, oddly enough, on technology and digital communication. You'd think they'd be more so because they tend to be more isolated. But I was talking to one girl who would say, no, she'd go and saddle a horse and ride her horse over to visit her neighbours. They're more physical. I think in a lot of ways, if you are athletic and physically capable and strong and reasonably outgoing and have got a reasonably good family, then growing up in the country is a great way to be. But if you're a little bit different, think a different way, different sexuality, different physical type, sometimes racial differences, that concentration of being in a small community makes you stand out and makes it much harder to find your people. Whereas in the city, if you're the goth kid, even if there's no other goths in your school, you can probably find them fairly easily, fairly locally. If you're dyslexic, if you're ADHD, in the city, again, you can probably find your people. Much harder to do in much smaller communities. If you're the only two goth kids for 200 miles, then your choice for friend is really limited. But the communities are much stronger. That everybody knows each other. You do know your local librarian, you do know your local cop, you do know the doctors as more than just somebody at the clinic that you turn up and take a number. So there's subtle differences that can be both strengths and weaknesses. And I think leaning into those strengths of that community bond, of that people tend to know each other, a bit more able to keep an eye out for each other, and being a bit more aware that the kids that are a bit of the square peg in the round hole need that extra support. And that often I think what happens, it's not deliberate or cruel, but it's just they get a bit forgotten. And sometimes a bit of extra reminding ourselves that, oh, that kid is a bit of a square peg. So reminding that kid that you're still part of our community. You still live here. You're still part of this group that we all live in, and we're still here for you. And again, prepping your version of Uncle Bob. Sometimes my kid doesn't always feel like they fit in. What can we do to give them somewhere else that they can feel that?
Now, I do want to make sure that we've got time for questions. So if anybody hasn't yet typed a question, now would be a great time to start typing it, and we'll come to them in just a few moments. I just want to go back to something that you said earlier, though, when we were talking about, that girl's story and that boy's story that really prompted, that start the book, and thinking about her and the fact that, she was happy with a certain level of interaction, sexual interaction, but then didn't want it to go further and felt scared to say no. We've talked a lot about boys, and there's obviously some very deep-seated issues that won't be fixed overnight, but need to start with the young children and a whole sort of societal change in many ways. But that's true for girls too. So for mothers or fathers of daughters who might be tuning in tonight, what can we do to sort of help our girls feel more empowered and better equipped to have the confidence, is a terrible word to use, with being able to say no.
I think again, it's such a complex question, because in the same way that boys are taught you have to be this to be a good man, I think there's still some hangover myths about girls that you don't want to upset people, you have to, placate, be nice, make everybody happy, put aside your own needs in service of others. That tends to still be there, probably in different ways, but I think there's a bit of that there. So for young girls to have the confidence to say, I need this to stop, and that need is more important than your need for it to keep going, and I have the right to say that, and I have the right for that to be respected. For some girls, it's very easy. For some very strong, bright, confident girls, they will just say so, and they sit there in classrooms going, well, why don't you just say it? I don't get it. But for a lot of girls, it can be a lot more difficult. They may be afraid of how he'll react, and not necessarily afraid of violence, but what if he doesn't like me anymore and I want him to keep liking me? What if he laughs at me? What if he thinks I'm being silly or juvenile? What if he goes and tells everybody else? How do I say it? How do I say that I just want this part to stop, or I just need a minute, or I'd like to try something else, and I don't know how to say any of those things, so they get overwhelmed and freeze up. And I think one of the things as adults that we need to remember is that it is not easy to talk about sex. Most adults don't find it easy to just confidently come out with, well, I like it this way, and then I want a bit of this, and then I want a bit of that, and 5 minutes on that, and then we can stop for a bit and then start again. It's not an easy thing to do unless you've been with somebody for a very long time. And even then, it takes a while to learn it, right? So understanding that these are young people who are still trying to manage all of the emotions that come with just being a teenager, and all of the emotions that come with new sexual interactions with somebody. And then trying to understand on top of that, I don't know how I feel. So sometimes it can even just be, I'm not sure what I want. I just need a minute to think. So one of the things that we know makes it easier is thinking about it beforehand. Because in a highly charged emotional situation where you've got to try and work out what you want, what's going on, and then decide what to do in a fairly short space of time, when you've had no preparation, it can all get a bit overwhelming. But if you've had those discussions with somebody, consent educator or a parent or somebody else in the community, about things that you can say. So instead of going, no, stop that, I want you to stop, what you can say is, oh, hang on, just give me a minute. Or if you're not sure how they're going to react, I need to go to the toilet, is always a good circuit breaker. I just need to pee. Just to give you that time to take a breath, take your phone with you if you're really worried. That can be another good trick. You can think about if that was to happen and you take your phone with you, who do you call? Do you call mum? Do you call a friend? Do you call an auntie? Do you call a brother, a sister, somebody else? What are some of the other things you could try? Oh, I don't feel well. I'm starting to feel sick. Now, that obviously what we would like is for girls to confidently be able to say, hang on, stop, I need a minute. Can you just give me a sec? And know that the person that they're with is going to listen to that and respect it and give them that minute. But it's unrealistic to say that that's going to happen every time. So while we certainly talk to them about, you absolutely have the right to determine what happens to your body, you have the right to change your mind at any moment, and you should be able to expect that the person that you're with, if they care about you, will listen, or even if they don't really know you all that well, just as being a decent human, will stop and will listen and will respect what you're saying. But being practical and living in, unfortunately, not an ideal world, to also give them some other techniques. Even if you think this might not happen, you go off to the toilet, come back a few minutes later, and then say, actually, do you mind if we stop for a bit? It's all getting a bit much. That those kind of things that are really practical examples of a variety of ways, so that when they're suddenly in that situation and they don't quite know what to do, they've role played 5 or 6 different things they can say. And just use the first one that comes to mind. But without that preparation, often what happens is that freeze response.
And I guess perception, perception is a huge thing. And if girls have seen porn, which obviously a lot of teenagers have, and the boys have this, expectation of what a girl should do, and the girls are potentially terrified by the expectation of perhaps what they think they should do, they really can lose sight if they're inexperienced. It's the first time of what is right and what should be right, and why don't I enjoy that? And so it makes it even more complicated. And as you've said before, when I've chatted, if parents think that their teenagers aren't watching porn, they need to sort of wake up a little bit, perhaps.
Yeah, it was actually, I wrote about it in the book. There was a great paper done in Melbourne about this, and the paper's actually called Not My Kid, where they did a survey of a whole lot of parents in Melbourne who all went, oh yes, porn is a terrible problem amongst teenagers, but not my teenager. And you think, yeah, I keep hearing this, and every parent thinks it's not their kid. So not every parent can be correct. Some of them might be, but not every parent can. And in some ways, I think talking to teens about porn is almost harder than talking to them about sex. But certainly we know that it is absolutely 100% happening that teens are acting out what they've seen in porn, because they think that's what sex is supposed to be. And nobody's ever told them that it's not. So it's taking the ones who haven't seen porn by surprise, and they're horrified. It's causing all kinds of confusion and upset for the kids who are trying to recreate it, because they think that's what they're supposed to be doing. And it's very easily to prevent, because it's quite a simple concept for kids to explain to them that what they see on a screen is not real life. Iron Man is not flying around in a metal suit buzzing people with lights from his hands. They understand that. You don't expect to learn how to drive by watching Fast and Furious movies. They completely understand that. So you don't expect how to learn to have sex by watching porn. But because porn can look sometimes like it's not a movie, it's not professional, and particularly free porn, which is usually the only kind that teenagers can get to, they see some really horrific things. And it's difficult for teachers, because firstly, you don't want to have to make teachers watch some of that really awful porn so that they can talk to kids about it. That would be grossly unfair. But we do know that kids are seeing this, and not even necessarily that they go looking for it. Sometimes they're shown by their friends, and then they get curious. So they go, well, what is this thing that I saw? And then disappear down a rabbit hole that they never intended to, had no idea that was even there. And it can really distort their perceptions after a while. So having somebody just gently pull them up and say, this is what porn is. It's simulated sex filmed for adults. It is not education. It is not realistic. It is not kind. It is often not consensual, and it's often violent. And so if you try and reenact this in real life, you could be doing harm to yourself and to the person that you're with. A fairly simple thing to say. One of the things that I say a lot with talking to teens about sex, because it's about porn, such an awkward conversation, a really great way to start it off is when they're in the room, but not necessarily participating in the discussion, have a discussion with another adult about, use the book, or this, everybody who's here, use this session. I was watching this thing on the light from Author Talk at the library the other day. She said these things about porn. What do you think about it? And have a discussion, and prepare your friend beforehand so you both know a little bit about what to say. I can absolutely guarantee you that if you've got a teenager in the room who hears you two talking about porn, they might look like they're not listening. They have got ears on elastic and they are hearing every word you say. And then leave it a day or two. And then, so I noticed you kind of looked like you might have heard something I was saying to Sue the other day when we were talking about porn. Did you have any questions? Just as a way of starting the conversation. They may say no. They might say yes. There are also some good online resources to find for yourself. If they do have some questions, or if you're finding the conversation difficult, I'll send you a couple of links. Let me know if you have any questions about it. That kind of thing can really help.
Now, talking about questions, I don't know if there are any questions yet, but I will just check in quickly. Yes, have a drink of water because you've been. Vicky, are there any questions or comments from anyone in the
There is
audience?
a question, yes.
Yeah.
From Miranda, she was wondering what your thoughts are on how victim blaming or slut shaming narratives impact how young people navigate consent.
Great question, and sadly it is very true that not everywhere and not all the time, but in some groups it seems to just, it's like a virus. It just catches on, and suddenly everybody in that social group or that year level or that school just suddenly all buys into it at once. It's quite weird. But yes, that ties into a whole lot of myths where boys always want sex and girls are the gatekeepers. And if they don't do the right thing or say the right thing all the time, then they're asking for it, and therefore anything that happens is their fault. So trying to talk about consent in terms of girls also actively wanting sex, because girls have strong sexual feelings too, and they can be as strong and they are as legitimate as every other gender's sexual feelings, can be quite shocking for people. And girls feel shame about having those feelings. So trying to say to them, it's okay to have those feelings. That is not bad. That does not make you wrong or shameful or anything like that. To want to explore them with somebody that you feel safe with, that you feel that it is consensual with, is not shameful. To want to stop at any point is not shameful. It's about understanding what you want and how you feel and what is right for you. And trying to get past shame to get to that can be really bad. And the thing that often people don't understand about that shame is that often what you'll get is people pushing back on it, and they feel that shame and think, well, I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to prove that I'm not shameful. And so will often push themselves into sexual activity that they don't necessarily want, but they're doing it as a form of rebellion. Whereas if they have the confidence to say, well, this is not something I need to feel ashamed of, so all I need to think about is how I really feel. Do I want this? Am I comfortable with it? Can I say what I want? And then they're not reacting to shame by either caving into it or rebelling against it.
Thank you. Vicky, is there any other questions or comments?
Yes, it's one that's just come through. So this is from Louise. Hi Jane, as a parent raising young kids aged 3 and 8, I've always tried to teach them bodily autonomy and consent around hugs, etc. Coming from an Italian family, it's been a battle with them at times to understand and respect my kids and our boundaries. We've advocated at every turn, but do you think the consent discussion could also be tailored to specific backgrounds or cultures to start it earlier on?
Yes, I absolutely do. And in fact, I think it should be. I don't think that we should be going out to everybody saying, I certainly don't think I should go to everybody and say, well, this is how it works in my family, so this is how it has to work in yours. Because that's just, apart from anything else, it's not going to work, but it's also kind of abhorrent. So in some cultures where it's actually not just rude, but almost offensive for grandchildren to refuse to hug their grandparents or to refuse physical contact, it can become quite dangerous in some cases. Obviously not all, but sadly, sometimes we know that the most likely perpetrator of sexual abuse is somebody you know and somebody you're close to. So the way that we try and do it that's culturally appropriate is recognize those cultural norms and say, we understand how important this is, and we're not trying to get in the way of it. And we're not saying that you, Nonna, are the perpetrator, but we know that the most likely perpetrator is somebody close. And so we're not protecting them from you. We're asking you to help us protect our child from somebody else. And it's bringing them in. Nonna, you're part of what protects the child, by recognizing that, by asking for consent. And if they say no, allowing that. So it's not, you have to do this to be around my child. It's, please come and be part of the village that is protecting this child we all love. And that's usually effective. Sometimes you'll get a bit of, oh, but it wouldn't happen in our family. It wouldn't happen with our child. And I think that's sometimes wishful thinking. We can't, it's that, please God, don't let this ever happen. But reminding them that, well, no, of course, we're not seeing anyone in our family, but we know it can be people close to them. And so we're trying to teach our children that they always have the right to say no. And for their safety, please be part of that.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Jane. Vicky, other questions or comments?
Yes, this one is from Laura. Can you comment on how or if the respectful relationships curriculum is successful in schools currently, and if not, where do you think it needs to grow?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I would say in some cases, in some schools, in some communities, it's been hugely successful. In others, not so much. And I sound like I'm repeating myself, but it does come back to that village idea where it's taught off the curriculum by somebody, and keep in mind, when this is not being taught by consent educators, it's being taught by PE teachers. And I am absolutely not disparaging PE teachers at all, but they certainly don't have the training for it. And statistically, you've got 15,000 teachers. And of that 15,000 teachers, a certain percentage of them are sadly going to be survivors of violence, and a certain percentage of them are going to be perpetrators. Just the way the statistics work, hopefully in teachers it's a lower amount, because most teachers, I think, are called to teaching because they want to help young people, not harm them. But we know from the evidence that that's not always the case. So where it's not taught by people who really understand it, who understand the basis of it and the gendered myths that damage it and all the subtleties of how it works and what can get in the way, and how you teach it to a mixed group of kids where you'll have some gay kids and lesbian kids, you might have some non-binary kids, you'll have kids from different cultures in there. You'll have kids who've really soaked up some of those really toxic attitudes, and others who have a really sophisticated understanding of consent and have the ability to teach across all those spectrums and respond to all those different attitudes. It doesn't work very well. And if the school doesn't have either the capacity or the understanding to extend it to that whole of community, where they get the parents on board so that the kids are not going home and having the lessons they've learned at school unlearned when they get home, or when they go to their sports groups, or when they go online, it becomes much less effective. Where I've seen it work really, really well, where I walk into a school and think, I almost don't even know why I'm here, is when it starts young, when it's everybody, and when it's continued. So the kids that where it started at prep, and by the time I get to them at year 10, they're almost teaching me. And their parents are on board, their whole school's on board, all their teachers have done the PD, the principal's done the PD, everybody else connected to the kids has been asked to come in and do the workshops. Those kids are fine. Those kids almost never run into the sort of trouble that we started off with that story of the girl and the is it my fault story. And of course, you get a lot of variations in between, but it really does depend on the adults around them. We can't expect teenagers to do this themselves. We don't expect them to learn how to cross roads themselves. We don't expect them to learn how to drive themselves. We get everybody involved in teaching them how to manage road safety. We can't expect them to work this out by themselves either. And we need to get everybody involved the whole way through so that they can manage it safely. And that applies to the respectful relationships education as much as it applies to the consent education. They're very linked, but they are also very different.
Thank you, Jane. We are up to time, so maybe just one more question, Vicky. Is there one more question?
There are no questions, but just a couple.
Excellent. Well, that is perfect timing. Jane Gilmore, thank you so much for your obvious enthusiasm for this issue that's so important. Thanks for your time and sharing your knowledge and insights from the coalface of this. Teaching Consent in the Classroom. That's the book we're talking about tonight, Teaching Consent. Please look out for it at your local bookstore, or of course your local library, which in this case, probably many of you are part of the Latrobe or Miley or East Gippsland Library Network, and thanks to them for making this event possible. Jane, did you want to say the last word?
So, also, thank you so much to the whole library network. adore library talks. I do as many of them as I can, because libraries are, I spent that last hour talking about how important communities are. Libraries are always part of communities, and I think they really do perform as an essential service. Support your local library, and thank you all for coming and for showing an interest in this. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much on our behalf. Thank you very much. It's been very entertaining, enlightening and informative today, and I'm sure that the people who will go away with a more confidence to talk to their young people and their families. So thank you.
I hope so. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.